If you've already watched the last video on this channel, then you know that we took a look at a handful of games that are trying their best to keep a beautiful little genre alive. We spent some time with brand new games and characters that have not only taken inspiration from the games a lot of us grew up playing, but in most cases, managed to innovate and modernise a lot of what we loved about them all so much. Introducing fresh ideas into a genre that is so important to a lot of people's gaming journeys. We got some updated visuals and performance, some unique gameplay elements and movement mechanics, and even one that takes full advantage of the opportunities that modern technology has blessed us with, putting us directly in those familiar environments to create a level of immersion that really wasn't possible before now. It was so awesome to experience those games last time, and we really didn't have to look too hard to clearly see their inspirations, taken from games that dominated home consoles through the late 90s and early 2000s, managing to capture the essence of what made them all so special for us. Absolutely feel free to go and check that video out if you want to. It's long, but you don't need to have seen that to enjoy what we're doing today. See, it's no secret that nostalgia has become a more desirable aspect of games lately. Well, of media in general, to be honest. As we all get older and games carry on the trend of always striving for bigger and better, it's hard not to crave a little simplicity sometimes. But as technology continues to advance and game development becomes more accessible to anyone interested, a surprising trend has emerged around 3D platformers that for the sake of this video, I'm going to be calling the new old school. Games that aren't just taking inspiration from the titans of the genre, but instead doing all they can to emulate them as closely as possible. These modern creations are more than just a homage to a bygone era though. They represent a deliberate effort to recapture the magic, simplicity, and charm that defined a pivotal moment in gaming history, leaving me thrilled to welcome you all back to the 3D platformer revival. Just another quick side note from myself, but I understand that due to most of these games being newer releases, there may be a few that you don't want spoiled. Although it's not my intention to deep dive into the plot and discuss each of their endings in depth, my advice would be, if there's any that pique your interest in the first few minutes, chuck them on your wish list and use the chapter markers below to skip to the next game. If there are any moments where I do discuss something I think is a considerable spoiler, I'll chuck a timestamp in. But please consider this a warning that there will be footage of and discussion around most of the elements in each of the games we take a look at. But with all of that said, it's time to sit back, relax, grab another snack, and join me as we dive back in to the 3D platformer revival. I don't think it would be right to start this video with any game other than Kidz 64. Sitting here in 2024, I honestly think this might be the closest thing we'll get to a brand new N64 game. Not only in its visuals and music, but in the way they present the characters and their designs, the structure of the objectives, the level design and the secrets it has tucked away, the moveset, and even those little difficulty spikes that would cost 7-year-old me the better part of a Sunday afternoon. As someone who grew up with an N64, playing through Kidz didn't give me a feeling of nostalgia because it looked like games I used to play. It genuinely gave me that feeling of revisiting a game that you haven't in a while, sinking back into these worlds and locations you would get lost in for hours as a kid, rediscovering characters that you haven't thought about in a little too long. Obviously that isn't the case. The game only released in 2023 and I have no idea who these characters are, but it really is such an incredibly authentic N64 experience. Admittedly, it's all a little bit darker in tone, with more mature writing and humour than you would normally expect from Nintendo, but considering it's the same platform that housed Conker's Bad Fur Day, it's really not too much of a stretch to imagine our little emo goat living right alongside him. Kidz 64 released on Steam in October of 2023, with a release on Nintendo Switch coming in April of this year. Not to get too sidetracked already, but it really is cool to see so many of these smaller games being ported over to the Switch. I know PC gaming is becoming the norm now, but I still think console gaming is a little more accessible to most, and more eyes on these types of projects is never a bad thing in my opinion. Plus, I just kinda think it's cool that a game that is so heavily inspired by the N64 now has its place on the Switch. So, the game was developed by Bogosoft, which I'm pretty sure is just one person. According to their website, they've been working on games for the last few decades, with the two most noteworthy being P2's Revenge in 2001 and Lyle in Cube Sector in 2006, both of which seem to be pretty rudimentary side-scrollers, respectfully. Then, a few years later in 2011, work started on Final Freakend, an N64-inspired 3D platformer collectathon starring a little emo goat. And I'm sure you can all tell where this is going, but after 10 years in limbo, a slightly altered colour palette and a name change, Final Freakend would indeed go on to become Corn Kidz 64. I'm gonna have to bring this up first because you can all see it, but Bogosoft have absolutely smashed the visuals out of the park, with everything about them encapsulating those comfy late 90s vibes. The low-res textures and blocky character models mixed with those super over-the-top cartoony animations. Yeah, it all works incredibly well as a throwback to the N64 era, but thanks to fun characters, awesome gothic color palettes, some atmospheric moody music, and its general level design, it really does stand on its own and looks incredible regardless of it emulating something specific. I especially love the neon greens and intense purples popping through the more muted browns and greys of the environments, along with Sev's animations like him sliding a little when changing direction or his mischievous tiptoeing when you ease back on the stick a little. Everything combines to fill this fantastic throwback feast for the eyes, and you can tell there's been thought put into the visuals here. It hasn't been thrown together with an old pixel filter dumped on top for effect. Speaking of which, you do have a few options in that regard. I spent most of my time playing this on a TV, and for the sake of recording the video, I would normally just leave the 1080p widescreen mode enabled. I don't think this necessarily takes anything away from the visuals, and if anything, just looks like you're playing an old game with the upscaling cranked right up. But for anyone that's looking for a more authentic experience, the 4x3, low-res, and CRT modes are all handled perfectly, and work incredibly well for Corn Kidz. So, finally jumping into the game, we're put in control of Sev, a simple goat after a simple thing, a serving of some delicious nachos. The cheesy chips will have to wait though, as he awakens in a recurring nightmare, stuck in a strange world with his corn powers being slowly drained away. What are corn powers exactly? No idea. In all honesty, I'm not entirely sure what the relevance to corn is in general. The dev answered some questions on Steam, but outside of it being a play on Stephen King's Children of the Corn, with some of the promo material even parodying the movie poster, they explain it simply as Sev having one horn like unicorn, and young goats being referred to as kids, so Corn Kidz. It really has no bearing on the game, and it's just an excuse to have a weird world filled with wacky characters, which is usually the case with retro 3D platformers anyway. During the start of the game, we're going to bump into fellow goat child Alexis, who will help us navigate the plot, the world, and our moveset. Some of it via dialogue, and some of it through sticky notes that she's plastered around the different environments. A really nice touch here is the writing style and incorrect spelling of bigger words throughout these notes. It's understandable that a young goat wouldn't really know the correct spelling of the word psychology, but it just adds to the charm that these characters are bursting with. After Alexis gives us the rundown, we're tasked with navigating a couple of areas, taking on different objectives to eventually make our way out of this dream and finally get our hooves on those nachos. The first of these areas being a pretty big tutorial level that is split into a few separate sections, teaching us the different aspects of our movement. Then the second is more of an open-ended area, where you're tasked with finding collectibles and solving puzzles. And the third area is basically a test of your platforming, needing you to navigate your way up this gigantic tower, putting together everything you've learned about your movements throughout the game to finally conquer this sweaty palm-inducing endurance test. Getting back to the first of these three areas for now, we're going to make our way through the tutorial stage, which is quite literally a big open playground that allows us to mess about with the controls. With some water for swimming, some enemies for bonking, some poles and ledges for climbing, it's all pretty standard for this type of game. But Sev is indeed a one-horned goat, and we can use that horn in so many fun and unique ways. This doesn't just open up the movement a little bit, this single horn blows the lid off of it. The moveset and level design is completely built around using the moves that this horn provides you with. You can use it from flat ground to either propel yourself forward to use against enemies or upwards to hit movable platforms. Then, in the air, you're able to use it to perform a ground pound. But propelling yourself forward after jumping is where you're really going to get the most out of it. You do get some extra distance doing this, which can be useful for horizontal platforming, but if you perform this headbutt dash into a wall, you'll stay there for just enough time to jump out of it again. It's kind of like a double jump combined with a wall jump. You're going to be using this a lot to help Sev traverse vertically, but the possibilities this horn provides doesn't stop there. You can headbutt specific birds to attach them to your horn, shooting them off again to blow up walls and cages. Or later in the game, you'll use that same technique to get a hold of these bouncy birds that you can use to get some huge height or distance by bouncing off the floors and walls. You can headbutt into cranks, spinning them to unlock doors, change things in the environments to solve puzzles, or even move platforms, which opens up some really fun sections. You can spin screws, popping them out of wherever they are for XP, or for even more traversal options, you can headbutt into boost pads on walls to give you a big push upwards, or into bubbles and birds to bounce off them, chaining this move to reach areas you couldn't without doing so. And there's even floating boost rings for a massive push forward in the air. And all of this is amazing as it is, providing you with so many fun and satisfying ways to make your way around in Corn Kidz. But then you'll even unlock the ability to dig underground. At first, this just allows you to grab a few buried collectibles and take out one specific enemy. But soon enough, you'll start seeing these different dirt paths that allow you to quickly travel up walls or even directly through them, introducing not just more traversal options, but even a puzzle element to the platforming, working out where you need to dive into the wall to pop back out in the correct place. Corn Kidz has done such an incredible job of building a fun and unique moveset around one simple thing. And what I love about it so much is you always have to give at least some thought to the next move you're going to make. Although the moveset is easy to learn and comfortable to use, you won't be blasting through things in autopilot mode. You actually have to think about the best way to tackle certain sections. And if you get a little too cocky with your movement, the game will punish you for it. But when you get it just right and you chain together a few of these different moves and overcome a tricky obstacle, the sense of satisfaction is immediate. After doing as much as you can in the tutorial level, Alexis explains that to get out of the dream, we're going to need to open a door with a mysterious owl's face on it, introducing us to Wallow's Hollow. The residents haven't been able to hold the annual lasagna festival because an evil owl has turned their mayor into a sausage and is holding him captive, meaning it's up to us to defeat the owl, restoring order to the town, unlocking the door, escaping the dream and getting our damn nachos. Yeah, when I said weird and wacky plot, I was not lying. This is where you're going to be spending most of your playthrough. It's a pretty big area as it is, but branches off into lots of little side areas, leaving you to collect a bunch of collectibles, overcome some different platforming challenges, solve puzzles, meet some charming characters, and just explore all that you can. Outside of the visuals, this is the thing that makes Corn Kidz feel most like an old school platformer, to me at least. Just think Banjo or Donkey Kong 64. You're given a basic idea of what you need to do, and Alexis will pop up from time to time to give you a little guidance, but it's left up to you to explore as much as possible, piecing together different elements to progress. I really think this is where the game will divide people, because if you are used to games giving you pretty clear objectives, it's possible that you're going to get a little bit fed up of searching an area for the third time or looking up guides to work out what's next. But if you're someone who grew up with or at least has experience with these types of games, this is all going to feel very familiar. In a similar way to our movement, this creates some incredibly satisfying light bulb moments when you finally put two and two together and work out the way forward. And I really like the fact that you have to stop and think for a second to work out what that next move is. I just think it makes you appreciate the bizarre world all the more when you have to slow down and really take it all in. It's not just a backdrop to the platforming, but instead an integral part of progression. needing you to get to know where everything is and keeping an eye out for any little clues or secrets. Some stuff can get a tad illogical at times, but as long as you're making sure you search as much as possible and give certain things a little bit of thought, nothing here is going to stump you for too long. Well, for finishing the game's story, that is. That same sentiment really doesn't apply if you're looking at getting full completion in this game. Logic goes out the window and you're going to have to interact with the environments in a way that you wouldn't really think of naturally. Vague clues dotted around in unsuspecting places, XP being deviously hidden in places you would never normally think to look, and even finding a collectible 5 hours into the game that you have no idea what to do with. The post-game stuff really isn't going to be for everyone, but it doesn't get in the way of you enjoying the base game, so to speak, and is still an amazing and rewarding addition for those willing to put the work in, filled to the brim with secrets and references. That's why I really don't understand the criticism of this game being too short. Yeah, it is short when compared to massive budget games with teams of devs working on them for years, and does only contain one real level and boss, I guess. But even without all the post-game stuff, it still took me 5 hours to complete, and for $7, considering just how enjoyable those 5 hours were, that's a steal. Especially when considering Penny's Big Breakaway took me around the same time to finish and cost 4 times the amount. Then, when taking into account all of the post-game content, you could easily rack up 10 to 20 hours depending on how good you are at platforming, how quickly you work out the puzzles, or how much you rely on the use of guides and forums to get through it. By the way, absolutely no shame in using forums for this one. It genuinely baffles me how people worked out how to find some of the things hidden within the smallest, darkest corners of Kidz. I understand that I spent a lot of time talking about the build up to the game and what happens after, but I am going to skip over the middle section. As I said, it's going to be the bulk of most people's playthroughs, and a lot of the enjoyment in Kidz comes from making your way around this town and solving its puzzles, and I don't want to run the risk of saying or showing too much and taking anything away from your own experience. If what you've seen so far has piqued your interest even a little bit, I highly recommend just grabbing this one and jumping in for yourself. I know myself and others have a tendency to focus pretty heavily on it being a great N64 style game, and it really is. But I wouldn't want that to detract from the fact that this is just a great game outside of its influences. Yes, the visuals are handled perfectly and I love the nostalgia I get from them, but the movement and controls, the characters and ridiculous plot, and the smart and incredibly fun level design make Kidz 64 a great example of a 3D platformer in general, and I'd go as far to say it's one of the best to release over the last few years. So whether you grew up playing games like this, or have no idea what CRT and 4x3 even mean, I highly recommend giving this one a little bit of your time and helping Sev finally get himself some nachos. So I'm going to be upfront with this and just say two things. First, I have no idea how to correctly pronounce this one and will continue to flick between Lunistice, and maybe even Lunistice. Who knows? The second thing is, the game's phenomenal. So to anyone who's here more so for a quick review of the game, well, if you're somebody who loves simple gameplay executed near flawlessly and just want to be able to quickly jump in and platform through some incredibly fun levels with a banger of a soundtrack and some gorgeous retro style visuals, just go and buy Lunistice and buckle in. For everyone else who's a little more interested in hearing about why I love this one so much, to the point where I even bought a pretty damn adorable plushie of the game's main protagonist, I will try my absolute best to talk you through it. The only problem is, I can't fully explain why Lunistice resonated with me as much as it did, which isn't especially helpful when trying to make a long-form YouTube video talking about it, but it honestly just scratches a very specific itch I've had in my brain for a while now. It was similar to the feeling I had when first discovering Oxenfree, which to this day is still one of my favourite games. I don't think either do anything particularly unique or implement something super innovative that we haven't seen anywhere else. They just seem to perfectly combine enough elements that I absolutely loved to make them one of those my kind of games. But it's also one of those games that I understand other people may not get the same level of enjoyment from. It's all incredibly simple and very upfront with what the game is going to be in the first level. If it doesn't click for you in the first 5 minutes, outside of some interest in visuals and level design, there's nothing later in the game that's really going to sway your opinion on it. For a little background, Lunistice was developed by a grumpy fox. Well, not literally. Let me reword that. It was developed by Dennis Kroner, a solo indie dev from Germany going under the name A Grumpy Fox. Dennis had previously worked in multiple roles within the gaming industry, both in front of the camera as a YouTuber and streamer, and behind the scenes on an online gaming magazine, a lead video editor, and as part of the publishing company Deck 13, who actually published Lunistice. He originally planned to make the game as part of a 30-day challenge, but realizing Lunistice had the blueprint to evolve into something much greater, he would fortunately end up spending around a year on its development and really fleshing out what was made previously. Lunistice is a fast-paced, level-to-level 3D platformer with some light collectathon elements. And as I touched on, it's all going to stay incredibly simple throughout, but I really think that works in its favour. We're given a pretty small moveset that will remain the same for the duration of our playthrough, consisting of a double jump and an attack that we can use in the air, essentially providing us with a triple jump. Movement mechanics and complex combos aren't going to be the focus here. Instead, your goal is always going to be getting through each of the game's levels as quickly as possible, avoiding deaths and collecting origami cranes to achieve a higher rank. I'm sure just by watching some gameplay you'll be able to tell that it's definitely more in line with something like Sonic, even borrowing those classic automatic loop-de-loops a few times. But for me, it always felt much more satisfying to play by keeping us in the driving seat for more precise platforming sections than we tend to get with the Hedgehog. Lunistice manages to balance the speed is key, gotta go fast level design with the more traditional 3D platformer running and jumping control that results in an incredibly fun and engrossing experience. It's very easy to slip into that one with a game mode when playing, all thanks to its simple but satisfying control, a phenomenally fun and upbeat soundtrack, and its level design and overall visual style that feels so familiar and nostalgic, but so fresh and exciting all at once. I do want to touch on the visuals very quickly, and then I promise we'll move on from this little Ellis gushes over game section of the video. But yes, as you can easily see, Lunistice manages to capture the bold colours and blocky geometry that were synonymous with the 32 and 64-bit era of gaming. But since it doesn't have to conform to the same restrictions older hardware did, we do get a lot of little modern inclusions that completely enhance the comfy retro visuals and make Lunistice a delight to witness. I know it might not do it justice when you're sat in your bed watching this on a phone screen, and you may be thinking, yeah, it looks good, but it's not that good. Well, when I was sat in front of an ultra-wide with the soundtrack blaring through my head, I was able to completely absorb the vibrance and little details of everything on display. And when pairing that with the fluid animations and subtle rhythmic pulses a lot of the enemies and environments give off, it was impossible not to be immersed in this colourful and intriguing world. But I've banged on enough about how much I love the world that we're presented with, so what's actually going on here? Well, to be honest, there's really not a massive amount of plot to sink your teeth into. The game does open with a very brief cutscene, and we are able to find lost logs and documents to piece together certain elements of a backstory. But the main things we know are, we play as Hana the Tanuki, with each of the levels taking place within her dreams. This setup allows Lunistice to have complete freedom with the game's different settings and environments, creating some incredibly beautiful and imaginative backdrops to blast through. These will be provided to us by a small selection of different themed worlds, with 2 levels in each. As we said, these will take us through a wide range of different environments that will all contain unique traversal options and obstacles, with some even introducing different level mechanics too. We'll platform our way through a beach by using brollies and bubble balls to get around, then into a cool amusement park world with these fast water slide sections and balloons we'll use to cross gaps, and then into a world straight out of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs containing different foods taking the place of traditional platforms. And those more traditional platforms move in and change into the beat of the music, requiring you to time your jumps. It was little additions like this that just kept sucking me back into that complete immersion I was talking about earlier. It's not like we're getting anything super unique that we haven't seen in some form in other games, but the fact that every level, world and theme is as good or even better than the last meant the most difficult part of Lunistice was putting it down. That does actually bring me on nicely to another thing that I think they've managed really well here, the difficulty. I'm not one of those people that tend to use games as a way to punish myself for the mess of a life I've carved out so far. And although I completely understand that there's nothing quite like the feeling of overcoming a section, obstacle or enemy that's been bothering you for some time, I tend to avoid games that are difficult for the sake of being difficult. To be honest, it's the reason I've left games like Silo Sybil off the video for today. But on the flip side of that coin, I do know that games that lack any sort of challenge can easily become incredibly monotonous. Even though Lunistice would have to introduce a lot more of that challenge before gaming journalists across the globe start to confidently claim it as the Dark Souls of retro-inspired 3D platformers, I'm happy to say that there are still enough sections of precise platforming and trickier jumps to still provide that satisfying dopamine hit when reaching that final goal gate. There's nothing here that's going to cause any frustration, but there will be plenty of moments of you slightly mistiming a jump, needing a replay of the level if you're going to be chasing those S ranks. It is nice because you can tackle the different levels how you see fit. You may be someone who just wants to get through everything as quickly as possible, ignoring collectibles and not worrying too much about restarts and rankings. You demons. But if you are someone who strives to see everything on offer, you'll be replaying levels to scour every inch in order to collect the 4 hidden letters and hundreds of cranes that they can include, unlocking secret levels, lore and endings as you do. There's plenty of replayability on offer here, with the secret levels and the addition of 2 unlockable characters that you actually may recognize, each having their own pros and cons. And despite these characters not massively altering how the game feels to play, they do at least change up how you approach a lot of the game's obstacles and just give you another reason to head back into each of the game's levels. Thanks to the game releasing on Nintendo Switch and running flawlessly on a lot of the handhelds available right now, it works immensely well as a pick up and play game for that quick fix of some pleasing platforming. As I said at the start, I understand that the simplicity that Lunistice provides may be a bit of a drawback for some of you, and I know I could sit here and wish for more levels and mechanics or deeper lore and story, but when taking it for what it is, the simplest way I can put it is I just really fucking like this game. The game's available on PC and Switch, with demos available on each of them. So really, there's no excuse not to just give this one a go for yourself and join Hannah on her journey through this alluring dream world. So I was initially in 2 minds about including this one in the video for 2 reasons. First, I was absolutely terrified of pronouncing it and didn't want people making fun of me on the internet. Then I remembered that I struggle with the word variety, and if anyone did want to make fun of me, that's the last thing I should be concerned about. But the second and most relevant reason was Pseudoregalia, nailed it, leans pretty heavily into the Metroidvania genre, which is just one that I haven't had all that much experience with. It's not even on purpose either. I've played games that fall under the category, but never really given it that much thought. The depth of my knowledge on them is basically games with non-linear progression, but I couldn't confidently give examples of games that handle the genre well, or those that don't. So I'm not going to be able to give an opinion on whether or not Pseudoregalia succeeds as a Metroidvania. But in all honesty, I don't really consider my videos reviews of the games anyway. I'm not educated enough to really break games down to that level, and I've always avoided giving scores or being too picky with the more technical side of things. I just like talking about games that I find fun or interesting, and Pseudoregalia certainly excels when it comes to both of those factors. Plus, with the tremendous retro-inspired visual style and the incredible moveset this one provides us with, it really wouldn't be fair to leave it out of a video based entirely on retro-inspired 3D platformers. Born from one of Itch.io's Metroidvania Month game jams, the first version of Pseudoregalia was developed in just 3 weeks by indie dev Ritzler. They did indeed go on to win the game jam, releasing that version onto Itch.io for free. Then spending around 4 additional months adding to and refining it, releasing a new and improved version onto Steam, which is the one that most people now have experience with. To paraphrase its Steam page, the game will take place deep within the realm of sleep, where we'll take control of a thick-thighed anthropomorphic goat lady named Sybil. I can only imagine the gigabytes of adult doodlings that now fill the deepest depths of DeviantArt thanks to this particular character model. Sybil finds herself pulled to a distorted castle through a mirror, where we'll need to explore as much as we can, growing stronger and unlocking new abilities to build up a deep movement system, fight enemies, find secrets, and free the weary soul of Castle Sansa. As stated in the brief synopsis, the game seemingly takes place within someone's dream, which I normally would just consider to be a bit of a lazy way to quickly throw together a rough plot. But here, it actually works amazingly well. Whilst there's not a massive amount of plot provided, the N64-inspired visuals already lend themselves so well to that sort of out-of-focus haziness and dreamlike feel that the plot sets up. And when pairing that with these large, empty liminal spaces, abnormal character designs, low-poly repeating patterns building up these strange and sometimes foreboding environments, and the beautiful droning ethereal soundtrack, it all just perfectly pieces together to provide Pseudoregalia its impeccable style and vibe. Entering the castle, we're greeted by our first area, the dilapidated dungeon. There's no real setup or plot here, no objective given or waypoint to follow, so with little more than a dreary atmosphere, some empty cages and 2 little goatlings in this first room, we take control of Sybil and immediately start one of the most important things you'll be doing through your playthrough: exploration. We'll start making our way through each of the rooms that we can access, quickly stumbling onto a glowing orb that will kindly provide us the Dreambreaker, a sword that's going to allow us to attack enemies, break through walls to reach new areas, and even heal us if we build up enough magic that's given when defeating enemies. A cool little mechanic that we get a little later on is a leveling system to this magical power. You're going to notice a number in the top left corner that will build as you defeat enemies. Getting up to level 2 increases our attack's range, and level 3 will increase its damage, but you're going to lose levels as you heal. It's a cool little risk-reward system that will allow you to defeat enemies quicker if you risk not healing. I do have some mixed thoughts on the combat, which we'll touch on a little later, but for now, we carry on making our way through the dungeon and get to our next upgrade, a slide. This allows us to move a little faster on the ground, can be used as a dodge to quickly move out of an enemy's trajectory, and later in the game becomes immensely useful for traversal but providing some extra distance, allowing us to jump out of the slide with a later upgrade. In the early game though, we'll mainly be using the slide to get under obstacles to carry on progressing. So this first area basically acts as a tutorial, just without the constant signs to read or NPCs getting you to repeat actions over and over. Instead, you'll just learn through doing, aided by a few smart and subtle visual cues to gently guide you as you're slowly introduced to Pseudoregalia's main gameplay loop, progressing through areas to find upgrades to your movement abilities that then allow you to reach new areas to get more upgrades to continue progressing. I know some of you are already using those furious little fingers to tell me in the comments that that's exactly what a Metroidvania is, but the only thing I would say to that is, I know, I just googled it. It's a great way to slowly introduce us to the movement, abilities, exploration, and the game's combat. I will say I was a little worried when our first main encounter is one of the game's toughest, but after dropping you in the deep end early, combat really isn't as much of a focus as I thought it might be. What I do really love about the progression in Pseudoregalia is it never felt like our new abilities just provide an easy solution. It's not like we need to get to a higher platform, so just unlock a double jump. We're instead provided with the tools to work towards that same solution instead. Just for an example, Sybil will unlock the ability to wall jump, but this is going to come in the form of 3 wall kicks that she can perform in succession before needing to touch the ground again. Rather than the expected magnetized jump onto a wall and jump back out again, we instead need to consider the angle we kick the wall, the direction we're facing going in and out of the kick, and even the speed at which we enter the kick. All of these things affect the outcome of this mechanic, and at first, to be completely honest with you, I didn't actually like it. It felt super awkward to use, and I could never confidently get Sybil to do what I was trying to do. But like many of her moves, once you put a little practice and patience into them, they quickly become incredibly freeing and immensely satisfying to use. It's a similar feeling when unlocking the wall run. You may expect this to just bridge the gap between platforms that are a little too far apart to navigate any other way. But really, you're going to be using the wall run as a way to link other moves together to really start covering some insane distances, or climbing heights that you never thought you'd be able to. You can tell Ritzler has really put thought into not just Sybil's core movement, but also the level design and their different obstacles to allow you to take advantage of the moveset in a way that not many other games have achieved. I'm trying to think of a few examples of recent games that provide a level of satisfaction close to Pseudoregalia's, but I really can't come up with any that quite hit that same level. Even Corn Kidz, for as fun and innovative as that movement is, just doesn't provide the same level of freedom that I feel when controlling Sybil. And whilst the moveset is pretty large by the end of the game, it always felt completely purposeful. Each of your moves needs you to put a little bit of thought into them to really feel the benefit, chaining them together with your other moves to really get the most out of them and start breaking down the invisible barriers that your earlier, slightly more restricted movement caused. Again, these additional abilities and movement options aren't quick keys to use to unlock the next area. They're instead a small piece of a much larger puzzle that's slowly added to your skill set for you to hone and master, making traversal of the castle grounds an absolute dream. It really does provide us as a player the sense of complete control over our movement, and whilst there are a few sections or obstacles that can only really be overcome with an unlock, a lot of the game's level design and platforming challenges can be overcome in multiple ways, and whether intentional or not, can sometimes feel like you're breaking the game by getting through a section in a way that doesn't seem intended. There were often times I would get through a section with some really precise movement, or by chaining together some of my existing moves, get to a later unlock and think, oh, so that's how I was actually supposed to navigate that section. But now, rather than that new ability making everything I did before redundant, it was just another tool I could use to push Sybil's movement that much further. I kind of felt connected to Sybil in a weird way. As she gets stronger and expands her moveset, I as a player get more comfortable and more efficient with my movement, always pushing it just a tiny bit further than I thought I could. I'm trying not to get too specific with the moveset or really deep dive into each of the game's different abilities, because a lot of the enjoyment comes from that slow progression and discovery that I would really recommend you experiencing for yourself. What I will say again, just in case I haven't made my feelings on it all clear enough already, is the movement and control here is absolutely impeccable. It's an easy comparison to make, but it really does feel like the complete freedom you first felt when experiencing Super Mario 64. Whilst Mario's moveset is still larger, and really it just makes me appreciate that game all the more considering it came out nearly 30 years ago, I still don't think there's many other games that nail the movement quite as much as what Pseudoregalia has. While we're talking about the best aspects of the game, I do have to touch on the visuals again. I don't know if it's to do with me getting older, playing more games, or just enjoying different things in those games these days, but I do find myself enjoying the visual direction and art style of a game far more than visual fidelity or complex lighting systems. Don't get me wrong, I'm still impressed by how far some studios can push games these days. I personally think Forbidden West is still one of the best looking games of all time, but Pseudoregalia is a prime example of how sometimes less is indeed more. Unless we're talking about the games included give Sybil pants option, then I guess more is more maybe? I don't know. The N64 inspiration is obvious here, but I do love the little inclusions that push that visual style up to the next level, like these echoing trails that follow certain animations. But I think the best part of the game's visual style is just how well it uses empty space to create some incredible atmosphere throughout its environments. It almost feels like you're playing through the memories of this place. Someone thinking back and remembering the main layout and landmarks of a specific location, but the smaller details being erased to time. Whether or not you believe this ties into the game's themes of dreams, memories, and loss, well, that's up for you to decide. But regardless of any deeper meaning, these large empty spaces that are interrupted by massive ominous structures that you can't quite see where they lead creates a huge sense of intrigue and just drives that eagerness to keep moving forward to see what you can uncover next. I think my favourite area was when you first leave the constant grey walls of Castle Sansa and emerge in the bright outdoors of its courtyard. I think the open sky and brighter colour palette almost felt like taking a deep breath for a moment, providing a little break from the seemingly never-ending maze of the indoor areas that only seem to get deeper and darker the longer you explore. This is also the area that will lead you to the tower remains that provide you your only real objective. Following a broken bridge, you'll come to this huge tower that contains some more abilities to find and some platforming challenges that will eventually lead you to a large locked door, needing 5 keys. There's also 5 stones that, as you may have guessed, all give vague clues about the keys' locations and what general area they're in. Then it's up to you to navigate the areas, find the keys, return to the tower, open the door, and finally face whatever may be hiding behind them. So here is where we're presented with the first of only 2 things that I think some people may consider to be negative about the game. I played the game when the map had already been added, but originally the game had released without one. But even with the map now providing an overview of the different areas and how everything connects together, I still found myself getting lost a fair bit. So can only imagine how much more frequently this would have happened if I didn't have the little bit of help that the map provides. Personally, I'm not always a massive fan of vague navigation or spending hours on end backtracking through locations I've already visited. And whilst that's more of a personal preference than an issue with any of those games, for once, I actually think it makes sense in the context of Pseudoregalia. The whole game requires you to learn through doing, explore as much as you can, and remember not only how to use your different movement options, but also where to use your different movement options to get to where you need to go. A lot of the areas do have different visuals and colour palettes to help differentiate between them, but even so, it can all get a little overwhelming and confusing at times. But I think getting lost here is okay. It taught me just to slow down a little and enjoy exploring these environments, taking in as much as I can along the way. Plus, the movement is so enjoyable that I just focused on the process of traversing around the game instead of constantly pushing to progress it. Whether or not you'll find the task of navigation to be a burden is completely personal preference. I have seen people saying how much they hated trying to work out where to go at times, and I can't even say that I wouldn't have taken advantage of a fast travel had I had the opportunity. But what I would just say to anyone who's thinking about jumping into Pseudoregalia, and I really think everyone should jump into Pseudoregalia, just enjoy the process of being lost and spending a little more time in these beautiful environments. So the only other thing I wanted to touch on quickly is the combat. It's the only other aspect of the game that I can see anyone having an issue with. I'm kind of in 2 minds about it all, to be honest. Whilst for me personally, I don't think it added all that much to the experience, it at least never gets in the way for too long. A lot of the enemies act more like obstacles that you need to avoid whilst platforming, and whenever you do need to engage in combat, it all stays pretty simple and fast anyway. Credit where credit is due, Ritzler seems to have put a lot of thought into the combat to make sure it stays as silky smooth as the rest of the game. Whilst it's incredibly simple, Sybil never has to stop moving to attack. There's no standing in place and trading strikes with an enemy. You can carry on using that incredible movement to dance around, dipping in to land a few strikes, sliding away again before getting hit. Once I started thinking of enemies as just another opportunity to use the movement, I enjoyed its inclusion a lot more. There is a point later in the game where the combat becomes a little more involved and important, but I'll leave you lot to discover that on your own time. My main takeaway from it is the combat has a lot more room to develop than the platforming does, but that's why I'm so incredibly excited to keep Ritzler on the watch list. When you remember that a massive amount of what Pseudoregalia offers was there after just 3 weeks of development, it's easy to imagine what they'll be able to do with 3, 6 or even 12 months. I'm not really bothered about what the next Call of Duty looks like, don't really care that you can do a handstand in Assassin's Creed now, and have absolutely no interest in seeing what new pop star or Marvel character appears in Fortnite. But you better believe that I cannot wait to see what people like Ritzler, Bogosoft, or a Grumpy Fox will be putting out over the next few years. There's a few reasons that I want you to go and check out Pseudoregalia for yourself. First, it's just a phenomenally fun time, and for the sake of a $5, yep, just a $5 for this one, I don't know many people that wouldn't find enjoyment in at least one or two aspects of the game. The movement and complete control you have over Sybil is some of the best I've experienced, especially in the indie scene. And the beautiful visual style and incredibly interesting world that's been built is worth exploring for yourself. The second reason is, I truly believe that Ritzler deserves the praise and support they've been receiving for this one. And I think it's only right that they're financially compensated for that too, especially considering how fair the price of entry is. And lastly, and most selfishly, I just really want to play more games like this. I want Ritzler to have the freedom and opportunity to keep doing what they're so talented at, and would love to see a Pseudoregalia 2, an expansion or DLC, or even an entirely new project with the same awesome movement and smart design that's so apparent here. If anything you've seen over the last 10 minutes or so looks at all interesting to you, and you're able to, go and spend some time exploring the deepest depths of a beautiful dream in Pseudoregalia. Can you imagine I made a massive fuss about pronouncing the name right and it's actually Pseudoregalia?
Pseudoregalia.
Oh, for fuck. Pilfer's Story of Light doesn't do as much to emulate the same retro style some of the games in this video do. Whilst there are still some clear elements shining through, it doesn't owe its entire identity to a specific visual style from an older console. Instead, there's a particular reason I wanted to talk about this one, and that reason is none other than the Prince of Platformers, Super Mario. Basically, every aspect of Pilfer is inspired in some way by different 3D Mario games, but quite clearly owes most of its influence to Galaxy. And I really don't think its developer would mind me saying that either, considering he said himself that he'd worked hard to replicate the feeling he got when first playing the Wii at 10 years old, wanting to instill just a little bit of that same feeling into gamers that grew up with those same games. Plus, he just kind of flat out said it was Galaxy inspired in an old Reddit post. But despite Pilfer borrowing pretty heavily from it in a few ways, this isn't another case of some small studio trying to cash in on the success of a beloved franchise by banging out some lazy copy and paste of a popular game. Instead, it feels much more like a genuine love letter to them, borrowing elements from its source material but molding each of them into its own little version. Pilfer was developed by Vincent Prom, who goes by the name Log64. A young solo dev who, after releasing a smaller free experience with Crow Story, got to work on Pilfer. After about a year in full-time development, it would release on Steam in August of 2023, maintaining positive reviews to this day. As you might expect, we'll be controlling Pilfer through a surprisingly large array of themed levels, all with their own visual styles, colour palettes, characters and level mechanics, using a multitude of movement options to get ourselves around, whilst keeping an eye out for any collectibles to spend on some cute customization options. We're really not going to be doing anything we wouldn't have done 1,000 times already in a bunch of other games. But how Vincent has managed to tie it all together into a solid 4-hour experience, with some good movement, fun level mechanics and at times, beautiful visuals, well, that's what helps Pilfer stand out a little more in a crowd of countless indie platformers. The game will open to a short cutscene styled after a storybook, where we'll learn that years ago, a group of brave explorers had tried to defend a great forest against an evil darkness, but had unfortunately failed, sacrificing themselves to seal away the darkness but stripping the forest of its light. We'll then jump forward a few years as we join Pilfer and Poppy, a brother-sister duo of treasure hunters currently in the middle of committing an act of fruit-based gang violence. We're briefly put in control to get to grips with our movement before stumbling across a spirit lantern, which is an ancient relic of light. These lanterns will become the driving force of our adventures, being the main collectible we'll be aiming to acquire in every level. Our treasure hunting escapades are unfortunately cut short as we're interrupted by the game's big bad Caligo, hurting Poppy and giving motivation to our hero to track down the lanterns, defeat Caligo, and return light to the Great Forest once again. It's a very familiar tale of good versus evil, light versus dark, raccoon versus owl. As straightforward as the narrative is, I do appreciate the level of effort put in to create a pretty established world, with its different regions all having their own bits of lore and unique inhabitants, with different characters referencing different parts of the story. It's surprisingly cohesive, and although it's not going to be able to do enough to get most people really invested into the world, it fleshes it all out nicely and at least provides a good enough level of motivation to both Pilfer as a protagonist and us as a player. After this setup, we're going to be dropped into a pretty simple opening level that's going to introduce a few of the game's mechanics and provide a nice big area to get comfortable with our movement. That movement being simple enough for basically anyone to pick up and play, never really needing you to perform any complex combinations to complete what you need to, but still leaving enough room for a few more advanced moves for players who want to utilize any little shortcut or platforming routes, completing the different levels as quickly as possible. You'll get the expected double jump and wall jumps, plus a dive and dive cancel that will get most people through the game. But then there's a ground pound we can jump out of at just the right time to perform a high jump, a crouch that will also allow us to long jump, and even some side flips in true 64 fashion. It's a great balance and just means it never gets too tough for less experienced players or too boring for the more professional platformers. My only concern at first was just the general feel of the movement. It's one of those things that's a little tricky to explain without you trying it out for yourself, but it just felt a little too light for your slower movement speed. I think either giving us a faster run with these floatier jumps, or keeping Pilfer a little slower but adding just a touch more weight could have helped. But saying that, I did play this right after playing Lunistice, which is much faster in general. So after adjusting that muscle memory and getting used to it in this first area, I had no issues with the movement for the rest of the game, and in general, Pilfer is a pretty fun little guy to control. We're going to bump into another character early on called Lumi, who will tag along with us. And while it is nice to have a little company on our travels, Lumi is also going to provide us with a load more ways to interact with this world. They'll act as a basic attack, throwing them out to dispose of enemies, break boxes, or even just collect some coins. But will also allow us to interact with zip lines and Galaxy-style launchers to reach different parts of the levels, levers and switches to change things around the environments, swing from grappling points, trigger platforms in some of the later regions, and in another Mario-esque mechanic, briefly take control of different power-ups, weapons, and forms, opening up some really fun little sections throughout the different levels. Again, there's nothing here that's particularly unique to Pilfer, but feels like Vincent has taken a lot of the best parts of a few different games and combined them all together into a moveset that really was a lot of fun to use. and also did a great job at slowly introducing more mechanics as we progress, keeping that consistent feeling of fun progression throughout. And that feeling was helped massively by the incredible level design too. I know I've banged on plenty about how I will always value movement and the control we have over our character way above level design. But I think Pilfer's levels have actually managed to do enough to flip that for me, and I really think that they carry the game. First off, I'm just incredibly impressed by both the amount of levels we get access to and just how unique each of them are, especially considering Log 64 is doing this solo. Rather than me pushing to progress in the hopes of unlocking some new movement mechanic, I was always excited to get to the next area just to see what interesting environment I'd be spending the next few minutes in. Things are going to start off pretty standard with the galaxy inspiration, with everything being based around light and space, with this sort of ethereal aesthetic to everything. This mainly stems from the hub world we're introduced to after completing the opening area that will give us access to each of the game's levels, needing to collect a set number of lanterns to unlock them progressively. Huge Mario vibes here too, with Vincent obviously basing a lot of its design on Galaxy's Comet Observatory. But it's a cute little area to explore between levels, with a bunch of the game's characters showing up in different places, revealing small pieces of the world's lore. You can also unlock some challenge levels here for lanterns and spend any coins you've collected on a pretty big selection of customization options. You won't be spending hours of your time here, but I really enjoy its inclusion over a standard stage select, and it just contributes towards establishing the game's world even more. I'm just going to quickly go back and speak on some of the game's levels here. There's too many to talk in depth about all of them, but I just wanted to mention some of my favourites so you can at least get a taste. First of these is the Hive, a collection of levels based in a big industrial honey factory. Yeah, again, Galaxy, I know I am going to stop mentioning it now, but I still really love the design of everything here. A lot of the obstacles are honeycomb shaped, with big gears and factory lines providing some fun platforming, with these sticky wall sections and rail grinding spicing up the traversal a little. It was just a nice surprise to see when I was expecting most levels to be based around either an outer space aesthetic or the standard grass world, water world, lava world and so on. After the Hive, we can check out Silken Caves, and despite its name, these are all fairly big open levels with lots of different ways to traverse them. We'll be using bouncy mushrooms to clear some huge gaps, platforms you need to attack first to reveal, others that will need light to materialize, needles that you can use to fling yourself over gaps or up walls, a few downhill sliding sections, and then a few of these little spiderweb thingamabobs that will allow you to glide after bouncing on them. There's just lots of fun little ways to make your way around, and to top it all off, I love the environments and some of the obstacles being made from yarn and buttons. Staying on theme for this being home to spiders, who I can only imagine would be big crochet fans if they had the thumbs for it. I also wanted to mention the region of Aurora Mundus. Outside of disappearing platforms, you won't be doing anything super unique here, but just from a visual standpoint, these were definitely my favourite. They have this deep sea, deep space kind of thing going on, with some beautiful purples and deep blues contrasted by these fluorescent jellyfish, with this soft teal underlighting bouncing off different pieces of the environment. But my favourite region overall has to go to Roaring Fortress. It starts off pretty standard with some obvious Chinese inspiration, but not long after jumping into these levels, you'll be entering portals that will transport you into the shadows on the wall, needing you to hop back and forth to 3D space and the shadows to progress through the level. There are a few similar moments in the game before this that will need you to complete a short 2D platforming section, but just the inclusion of the shadow mechanic made this all feel super fresh, especially when you need to jump back and forth to move platforms in the 3D world to line up a platforming route in the shadows. It was just really cool to have this new unique mechanic so late into the game, no matter how simple it may be, and just backs up what I was saying about the levels being the strongest thing in Pilfer. I think it's incredible that we have so many new games that are pushing the boat out and introducing really unique gameplay styles to a genre that we've been enjoying since the 90s. And I never want that creativity and innovation to stop. But every now and again, it's nice to have a simple video game that just feels like a simple video game. Super easy to pick up and play with some cute visuals, good controls and fun levels. and I think that's what Pilfer does so well. It seems like a lot of the time when playing these smaller indie games, you normally have to sacrifice one thing for another. But Pilfer really does manage to establish a great balance of all the different elements that make a good game, hitting on a lot of the same notes the powerhouses of the genre are known for. Although it's really not fair to compare Pilfer to something like Galaxy, and a single dev is obviously never going to be able to keep up with an entire team of devs working non-stop on a game on one of the most successful franchises in the world, I think Vincent has done a damn good job at least providing a good alternative to them in the interim. Pilfer may not have the huge budget, in-depth storytelling, professional voice acting, visual fidelity, or polished to a point control that you would expect from a much larger game. But it does have that same charm, childlike magic, and simple, straightforward fun that made those bigger games what they were at the time. And I really did enjoy my time in its adorable little world. I've had a look through Vincent's socials to see what's next for him, and it seems like his upcoming project looks to refine and evolve some of the movement that Pilfer introduced, and I'm really excited to get my hands on it. Maybe even in another revival video at some point. But until then, I'll chuck all the links to Pilfer down in the description if you want to check it out for yourself, and spend a little time returning light to the Great Forest. Something I have noticed with games that are trying to replicate the look and feel of the classics we all love is a massive majority of them seem to be much smaller projects, most of the time just being a single person behind the development, and I think there's a few factors at play here. Firstly, despite not knowing anything about game development, I have to assume that making a game that looks like it came from an N64 is far easier than making a game that looks like it came from a PS4. Especially if a lot of these games are being made by one or two people who are maybe just starting out and don't have a massive amount of experience. I get huge passion project vibes from a lot of the games in this video, which I think is an awesome thing. People who have grown up with the same games as myself, just with the drive and the know-how to recreate what we all enjoyed about them. I understand that larger studios may not have a financial incentive to create niche throwback 3D platformers, so it's up to the indie devs to fill that gap, and I really do appreciate them for doing so. In general, most of the games we've played today are shorter than average, but there are a few that are even smaller than that, so I popped some together into a bit of a bite-sized buffet. First up is a little collection within a little collection with developer Siactro, also known as Marcus Horn, just a dude from Germany creating a bunch of these short and simple but fun and easy to play throwback games. His first venture into the world of 3D platformers came in the form of Kiwi 64, a modest collectathon heavily inspired by a particular bear-bird combo from Rare. It's pretty clear that this was one of his first projects, and to me, feels more similar to a demo or proof of concept than a full experience. We're dropped into a small single level and left to collect a few different items for a few different characters to earn lamps. Then, once we've got enough of these lamps, we'll make our way up this central tower and defeat the evil Melon King atop it. And that's basically it. Kiwi can move, jump, and has a single attack that we can use when stood or in the air. But navigating this small level and collecting each of the lamps is the only real thing for you to do here. It's literally a 10-minute experience, but I really like it as an introduction to both Kiwi as a character and Marcus as a dev. Despite its length and overall simplicity, it was still enjoyable to jump in and meet each of the characters, with a lot of them having that familiar dry, sarcastic British humour you would see a lot from Rare's own games. Like this funny moment with a sentient N64 cartridge taking a jab at nuts and bolts. The visual style is basic, but definitely hits its target of recreating those old N64 vibes, and the music is super fun throughout too. There's really not too much else to go into here, but it's still available to download on itch.io if you want to check it out for yourself, and at the very least it's a pretty good use of 10 minutes of your time. But really, the main thing Kiwi 64 did was create a strong foundation for Marcus to make his next games bigger and better. That next game being MacBat 64. Very similar to Kiwi in terms of it being a simplistic throwback to the banjo era, but now with a bunch of different levels and themes open for us to explore. The game opens with a brief recap of Kiwi defeating the Melon King before jumping ahead 2 years and introducing us to Macbat, a very distinguished little gentleman if I do say so myself. When sharing a drink with our pirate parrot pal, say that 5 times fast, he reveals to us that all of the Kiwi being's water is produced in the watery factory. But production has mysteriously stopped and no one can get in to see what's wrong. To solve this, we'll need to collect 6 keys dotted around the different levels to get in, solving the mystery and bringing water back to the islands. So fortunately, Macbat is a lot bigger than Kiwi 64, with a bunch of varied characters all beautifully recreated in the low poly blockiness we would expect, with some really unique levels, objectives and even gameplay styles to enjoy. The first plonks us on this tiny island, needing us to collect a few coins, reunite the monkey with his banana, and collect enough balloons to lift a cage off a key to collect it. This basic loop of collecting things for characters who will then give you another thing you need to collect for a key basically lays the foundation to most of the game. We do get a few different gameplay styles throughout which I'll get to, but for most of the 60 or so minutes you'll spend with Macbat, this is going to be the goal. It leans more towards the collectathon aspect of the genre over the platforming, which is also backed up by the moveset that we're equipped with. Macbat can flap his wings for a pretty good length of time before needing to land again, which takes away most of the jumping between platforms you would normally expect to see in this type of game. It's not really a bad thing, it just wasn't what I expected when I first started playing. But saying that, there's a lot of things in this game that I really wasn't expecting when booting it up. Like the abundance of really creepy out-of-place artwork in the game which kinda caught me off guard at first. For example, the second level was Sia dressing up in the style of a prominent Nintendo character before making her way through a small dungeon, solving some very light puzzles. This level comes with the inclusion of these slightly too realistic for comfort skeletons and this absolute monstrosity of a face. I mean, it makes a little more sense here considering the franchise it's parodying gave birth to this thing, but it was just funny for it to go from such a cutesy and vibrant first level to a dark dungeon with odd characters filling its walls, before moving on to a sickeningly sweet 2D platformer pulled straight out of Kirby. This back and forth continues as you make your way through a retro 80s inspired level, complete with arcade cabinets and a badass car section set to a backdrop of stylish synthwave. Then straight into a Mario Kart 64 style race before entering an old haunted house with creepy paintings and projections for you to enjoy. There's also this nightmare fuel in the last level, but I'll let you discover that on your own. To top it all off, there's the bonus levels we get access to after completing the main game, and that's where things really start to get batshit crazy. Pardon the pun. The first of these levels is another 2D side-scroller, but this time with a much darker atmosphere and more intimidating obstacles to avoid. Then moving on to a PS1 style survival horror with this twitchy arsehole shooting at us out of nowhere and rooms filled with giant bugs and alien tentacles. I was thinking about the inclusion of these horror elements when playing through some of the levels, and was wondering if Marcus was trying to recreate a similar feeling a lot of us got when first playing games like Mario 64, that often had these creepy characters or visuals that were always a little jarring when first seeing them. I honestly think the Jolly Roger Bay eel is the reason I still hate swimming in games to this day. Just its sheer size with those big old dead eyes was always so intimidating to me as a kid. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you remember Baby's first jump scare with that damn piano. But then I looked into Siactro games a little further, and I just think our boy Marcus enjoys a little horror alongside his love of retro 3D platformers. And it's something he actually includes in a lot more of his games, which we'll get to in a second. All in all, I think Macbat 64 is a great little game for what it is. It's awesome to see a bunch of different characters, visual styles, and genres crammed into such a small package. And for the sake of $2 and an hour of your time, it's cool just to see the nods and references to games that have obviously influenced it. And even without the things I've touched on, there's still a lot for you to discover on your own. Especially when the game literally encourages you to break beyond the walls of its levels in search of its many hidden Easter eggs. It's very funny because they're actually eggs.
After MacBat 64, Siactro underwent a bit of a stylistic shift,
moving from a Banjo-Kazooie inspired approach to one influenced more so by Sonic the Hedgehog, birthing the Tori series. There's a few different Tori games out at this point, each seeming to draw inspiration from various sources and showcasing slightly different visual styles. But the core of the gameplay always remains the same. Super simple, fast-paced platforming. In the first of the games, Tori 3D, we're going to play as this cute little chirp Tori, blasting through a selection of brightly coloured PS1 inspired levels in an attempt to catch this, and I quote, creepy mean guy who has stolen our ice cream cone. We'll access said levels through a very simple stage select screen before trying our best to make our way through each of them as quickly as possible. You're also going to see a bunch of stars dotted around to collect as well, needing you to try and work out the best routes to collect all of the stars and get the best time possible to achieve a higher rank. When I say find the best route, it's essentially getting through the level without making any mistakes or falling off of the stage. There's not going to be a bunch of different shortcuts you can discover and take to reduce your time. The level design is always about as complicated as our moveset, which for context includes a double jump and a run button. You won't be chaining together any complicated movement mechanics or tackling obstacles in weird ways to shave the seconds off. But the simplicity does manage to create some replayability when it comes to getting those higher ranks. Since you are so limited with your movement, it all comes down to nailing your jump timing and avoiding any enemies or obstacles that will slow you down. It really is a pick up and play type of game, and although I got through it in a single 40-minute sitting, I can imagine this would work great on the Switch or Steam Deck as a fun little 5-minute distraction when waiting for your 7th Uber Eats order of the week. And despite how straightforward everything is, they've still done a good job at creating enough separation in each of the level's visuals to keep it all engaging. City skylines, seaside sections, and snowy slopes are all in the mix. Then, on top of that, we get the standard inclusion of some light horror elements to ensure you're staying on your toes. Friendly stars quickly become foreboding as you make your way towards them. Snowballs open up to reveal huge teeth, and mysterious monsters emerge from the backdrops out of nowhere.
Again, there's nothing here that will actually scare you, but they can catch you off guard if you've slipped a little too far into autopilot.
Another thing I did enjoy, which was in MacBat 64 too, is his other characters being included throughout his other games. Kiwi makes multiple appearances in MacBat, and now MacBat and Tasty, another character from Marcus's game Tasty Ramen, are both playable in Tori. Tasty has a way faster run, and MacBat has the ability to fly endlessly, which, although doesn't do much for us here, becomes really important in Tori 2. Releasing a few months after Tori 3D, Tori 2 is much of the same, just with a few improvements in terms of replayability and level mechanics. The game opens with a super short cutscene of the mean guy, now named Glitchy, once again stealing our ice cream, leaving us to chase him through another set of different themed levels. We get a new addition in the first level with boost pads that are dotted around both the ground and in the air. These are used to either provide a short boost of speed or as a way to dispatch enemies, boosting into them to take them out. Again, the levels are all super bright and nicely varied throughout, and I especially like these neon holiday themed levels that reminded me a lot of Neon Splash's opening level. We're also going to get a few space and lava levels before getting to another new addition, an actual boss fight. Don't get me wrong, everything is still incredibly simple here, but it's really cool to see the new additions building on that base formula. You can actually see the progression of Marcus as a developer alongside Tori as a game. We're again going to get a few different characters to play as, but this time MacBat is way more useful. You're going to unlock him again by collecting all of the stars in every level, but we'll now use his endless flight to scour each of them in search of hidden discs. Collecting all of these will then unlock Glitchy, getting all A ranks unlocks Tasty, and all S ranks unlocking the super secret shiny Tori.
Doing all of this isn't going to take you much longer than an hour, so still not a massive amount of content. But there's still enough reason to replay each of the levels, and it all just feeds into that pick up and play nature of the series. Plus, the games are literally $1, so I'm really not expecting too much out of Tori. I know, like myself, a lot of you have searched through the endless waves of utter tat that are selling for $1 on the eShop.
So it's great to see a game that, despite the price tag and length, is still providing a pretty solid experience, and is only getting better with each new addition to the franchise. And that's easy to see when taking a look at Tori Saturn.
Now, the game isn't actually out at the time of me recording this, but luckily a demo is. And after playing through the single level that it contains, I'm genuinely excited to get my hands on the full game.
As you might have guessed from the title, the game takes inspiration from the Saturn era, and the little pops of details that the pixelated plants and trees allude to look amazing. I love how bright everything is here, and the extra details with vehicles and billboards in the background are all super fun.
Plus, the music is awesome too. But the thing I'm most excited about is the new movement.
Now, there's no button you have to endlessly hold down for Tori to run. That's just the default. So instead, using that button will slam Tori back down to the ground whilst jumping for a big boost of speed. This feels great to use and really allows you to bomb your way around, cutting corners and slamming down to maintain speed. Then there's also a Sonic-style homing attack that you use by simply pressing the jump button when the lock-on indicator is displayed, launching into boost pads and off balloons for even more speed.
I really can't wait to see how they build on this in the full game, and I truly believe that the Tori series could go from great for $1 to just great with a few more of these improvements.
If you're looking for more Tori, Panic Pack is available too, which is much of the same to be honest. Just 3 different themes with 2 levels in each. Kind of feels a bit like a mini Tori 3D DLC, so not too much I can add. But even if you're not completely sold, I would still really recommend downloading the demo to Saturn and getting it on your wishlist if you enjoy it. So now we're going to move back from the new bird on the block to the OG and revisit Kiwi. After laying the basic gameplay foundation with Kiwi 64, Marcus would bring back the bird after 8 years, releasing a follow-up fittingly called Super Kiwi 64. Jumping straight in, we'll get an opening cutscene that will show us a familiar little island with a few familiar little faces on it. Our pirate parrot pal returns to explain a mysterious floating island that can be seen from the Caribbean, inhabited by a few ancient civilizations and a lot of different treasure. His old partner had actually travelled there alone, never to be seen again, so Kiwi decides he wants the ganders for himself. Due to the treacherous winds, we end up stranded too, bumping into the captain's old partner who tasks us with finding enough ancient power cells to power his plane and get us both home. I'm not too sure why we need the plane when Kiwi has actual wings attached to him, but there we go.
There might be some context I'm missing in terms of plot, which is actually explained in another of Marcus's games, Beanie,
a 2D platformer emulating something similar to Donkey Kong Country, which apparently acts as a little bit of a prequel to this game. Marcus is out here trying to build lore on the same level as Kingdom Hearts. But for a simple 3D platformer, I think the opening cutscene is enough to go on as is. Taking the same collectathon approach Marcus had introduced nearly a decade prior, Super Kiwi 64 will see us jumping into 4 different themed worlds, with 2 levels in each, allowing us to complete a few different objectives in them all to earn the power cells we need. These will basically all boil down to very simplistic collectathon tasks, collecting all the gears in a level, going through 3 golden rings, or smashing 3 different targets, for example. It's all very basic, but just means that for every level, you can jump in, explore it as you complete a few small tasks, and then leave again before anything overstays its welcome. The first of these worlds is going to be a vibrant jungle, and the visuals really scratch that little nostalgic itch that these games always seem to create for me. Low-res repeating patterns making up the environments with tons of thick saturated colour thrown on top really do look awesome. Only strengthened by the luscious forestry, bouncy mushrooms and huge prehistoric bird skeletons. I think this opening level is Kiwi's strongest in terms of its visuals. The other worlds are all great, filled with the same vibrant contrasting colours, but I suppose for me, the green jungle just seems more in line with what I was used to seeing on the N64. But regardless of your preference, it's still a nice area for us to get to grips with our moveset, which has been expanded since Kiwi's first outing. We still have our standard jump and attack, but now with the ability to glide after jumping. But the biggest addition is being able to stick into basically anything with Kiwi's beak. This is going to hold us in place and even allows us to jump out of it, sticking back into the wall over and over again. It's a pretty unique little move that was really fun to mess about with, but my only issue with it is you never really use it in any other way than climbing a wall. What I mean is, there's no obstacles or platforming sections that need you to navigate them with this move, which I think would have been a great opportunity for some more unique and challenging sections.
That's kind of against Marcus's mantra when it comes to these games though.
They're all based around classic consoles, all super short but cheap because of that, and are all incredibly simple and easy to play through.
I appreciate the fact that all of these games are a nice way to switch off for 5 to 50 minutes and all provide a pretty relaxing experience.
But I would still love to see a little more depth in gameplay in a future release. He's absolutely nailed everything else, so deepening the level design and platforming is the next natural step in my opinion. If you've played any of his other games, you really do know what you're getting yourself into here. We still have the simplistic level-to-level gameplay, we still have the retro-inspired visuals, still have the light horror elements seeping into certain sections, and still have all the Easter eggs and different playable characters included too. This isn't going to be the greatest 3D platform you've ever played, and it isn't going to keep you busy for tens of hours. But if you're looking to jump into a simple 3D platformer that does a few simple things well, then you really can't go wrong with Kiwi or any of Siactro's other games.
I know I did mention it a few times throughout the different games, but I've tried my best not to focus too much on the tiny price tag that's attached to them. Of course, it is a bonus to be able to pick these all up for next to nothing, but I don't want to say that they're good only because they're so cheap.
As I said, you're really not going to be blown away by anything in any of these games, but I at least think the price allows Marcus and his games to under-promise and over-deliver. All of his games control nicely and are always fun to play through in spite of them being shorter experiences, but also have a little more depth to them than you might expect with the various references, unlockable characters, and odd horror elements mixed in with the simple but solid platforming they provide. I would still love to see a larger project from Marcus at some point, giving us just a little bit more to sink our teeth into, but as long as he keeps making fun experiences at a reasonable price, I'll happily keep buying them.
Up next is another developer with a very similar style to Siactro, both being solo devs putting out these shorter games clearly inspired by ones they grew up with.
Coming from Brazil, Kurigamedev has put out a handful of games on Steam since the start of 2022, with roguelikes, a kart racer, and a couple of 3D platformers thrown into their portfolio. The one thing they all have in common is the bold colours and blocky graphics inspired by older systems. First up, we'll take a look at Gwen the Hen 64, a straightforward 3D platformer that will see us speeding through 10 different levels to collect cocoa diamonds, allowing Gwen the Hen to build her infinite chocolate machine. To avoid any confusion going forward, we're not actually Gwen the Hen. The scientist making the machine is Gwen. We're just some nameless hen doing all the hard work so Gwen can take all the glory. Actually reminds me a lot of my first corporate job. So we'll start off in a small hub area that allows us to collect a few coins, get used to our moveset, speak to a few characters, and enter each of the game's levels through their corresponding portals. I really do like the inclusion of the hub world over a standard stage select here. My only issue with it is there's really not too much to keep you occupied. You can play a quick game of beach volleyball to earn a green coin, but other than that, the only other thing to do is use those coins to unlock extra health by consuming the breast flesh of the island's other chickens. The fact that that's the way you get help is both disturbing and hilarious to me, especially considering this breast dealer is coincidentally located next to a graveyard. Are we eating the flesh of chickens that have died naturally and donated their bodies, or are we consuming innocent inhabitants of the island just to make the boss fight a little bit easier? I guess Gwen the Hen contains some light horror elements too. Much like the visuals, the moveset we're provided with is incredibly simple. A single jump with the ability to flap our wings to glide, and a spin attack make up our main controls. There's also this high jump we can get by holding the crouch button and jumping, but I didn't use this a single time throughout the game. The only other option we have in terms of movement is a wall run that can be used as a starting point to perform a wall jump, or simply to run up walls whenever you can't jump high enough or land a little short. I really can't fault the small moveset because it was super smooth and fun to use throughout the different levels, but I always find myself wanting just a little bit extra in these games. You're not going to get bored of the movement because, quite frankly, you won't be using it for long enough. I finished this one in a single 30-minute sit-in. But although your moveset never develops, Kuri did a good job of adding new obstacles into each level to at least keep them engaging. Falling platforms and giant egg launchers, rotating flames and mushroom bounce pad, rotating platforms, spiky platforms, and rotating spiky platforms, and even some classic Mario-style alternating jump platforms. It all works together to keep each of the levels exciting as you progress, and with the different visual styles and music throughout them, despite everything remaining incredibly straightforward, I still think there's enough variety and enjoyment here to make it worth the £2.49 entry price. Not every game has to be some innovative masterpiece or needs to warrant a YouTube video claiming it's the best 3D platformer you've never played. Sometimes a 30-minute distraction for the price of a coffee with some fun visuals, level design, and controls is all you really need. The only other thing I wanted to talk about in regards to good old Gwen is that little 64 at the end of the title. I really wish it wasn't there. There's nothing in this game that looks or feels like something from the N64. Outside of its environments being blocky and our protagonist being pixely, the colour palettes, movement, characters and music aren't at all reminiscent of games we were seeing on that console. The only game I can see any sort of resemblance to visually would be Paper Mario, but even those games' visuals aren't indicative of a majority of games on the N64 anyway.
Is it a big deal? Obviously not. But I would much rather people look at this as a very simple but fun retro-inspired 3D platformer over a big swing and a miss as an N64-inspired platformer. I'm not entirely sure if that's the reason Kuri left it off his next game, but regardless, let's take a look.
It isn't exactly a direct sequel to Gwen. I mean, it does have the same art style, movement mechanics, control scheme, level design, and overall level-to-level layout, but this time, we're taking control of a completely new poultry protagonist, a pigeon called Prue. We'll be dropped into a small hub area, splitting off into a few rooms that will all contain a few different levels. Just like Gwen, we'll be rushing through a handful of different themes that will provide the levels with some unique obstacles, colour palettes, and music to enjoy as we run, jump, and dive around each of them. The one thing I did like a little bit more with Prue is how the level design all seemed to be a little bit busier than with Gwen, introducing more interesting obstacles fairly early on. When you have a moveset as simple as Gwen's or Prue's, you're going to have to rely a lot more on fun level design to bridge the gap that simple movement creates. But for the most part, Kuri has managed to achieve that. Again, there's really nothing that we haven't seen before or anything that gets more complicated than some falling platforms or projectile obstacles, but the levels are densely packed with just enough to keep everything interesting for the few short minutes you'll spend in any of them. Whether we're navigating moving platforms and crumbling floors to avoid falling from city rooftops, dodging fire as we're forced to race against the unwavering threat of rising lava, or strategically choosing when to jump so we don't fall, floating off into the endless emptiness of space. The ever-changing obstacles, simple but fun movement, changing themes with their bold and blocky contrasting colours, and the easy to pick up and play nature that the level-to-level gameplay complements so well, all combine to provide an experience that makes it worth the price of admission.
And then there's really not a whole lot else to say about it. It's difficult for me to really recommend checking out many of these smaller games based on their gameplay alone.
I'm not saying they're not good, quite the opposite in fact. They just don't do anything better than any of their influences. But if you are someone that just loves 3D platformers and is always on the hunt for new ones, supporting these up-and-coming developers really is a no-brainer. They're all priced incredibly fairly and it allows these devs to focus on and develop their crafts. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't excited to check back in with these guys over the next few years to see what they can achieve as they continue on their own journeys.
As I said earlier, I would love to see them take just a little more time and really sink their teeth into a single game.
Fleshing out the characters and their worlds, the movesets and progression, and even the storytelling. I do understand that it may not be viable for them to dedicate a chunk of their time to a single project. So as long as they do keep making me short and simple but solid and enjoyable games, I guess I'm just going to keep buying and playing them.
I'm going to pop all the links to Siactro and Kurigamedev, plus each of the games we discussed down in the description. So if you did like the look of any of them, please consider supporting and picking up a few for yourself.
There's a ton more of these bite-sized experiences available, with more releasing all of the time, so I'll be keeping an eye on a few of them to potentially check out in a future video.
But for now, let's get back to something just a little bit larger.
Okay, so for this one, I'm basically going to go back on everything I said in the intro and will admit that Penny's Big Breakaway leans more towards being inspired by older games rather than trying to emulate them exactly, but does still have a pretty apparent similarity to a few games starring that famous blue hedgehog. I mean, that is to be expected when the team behind Sonic Mania was in charge of Penny's development, but right off the bat you're punched directly in the brain by these incredibly bold, bright and blocky colours crammed into every corner of the game. It's all very reminiscent of the early Sega era to me, with some similarities to games like Sonic, Nights into Dreams, Jet Set Radio, and even the first Rayman game in some aspects. The visuals alone were enough to pique my interest at first glance, but after watching the initial reveal trailer last year, I seen what looked like this insanely fast 3D platformer with the potential for some really unique movement mechanics thanks to the yo-yo that took center stage in a lot of the promo material, and I've basically been waiting for any excuse to jump into it since. Releasing in February 24 on all major platforms, the game will see us take control of Penny. As she makes her way through Vanilla Town, a poster advertising auditions to team up with Emperor Eddie catches her eye, hoping to impress with her sick set of yo-yo tricks. This goes about as well as you would expect considering it's the plot of a 3D platformer, and after cutting the line to gain entry, Penny unfortunately loses control of her sentient yo-yo that launches at the Emperor, stripping both Eddie of his clothes and Penny of any chance to pass the audition. We spend the rest of our time on the run as a fugitive, trying our best to blast through each level as quickly as possible to avoid being captured by Eddie's gangs of penguin guards.
Yeah, the plot is completely bonkers, but like many games in the genre, it's basically just there to give our character an excuse to do whatever they need to do. Penny's on the run, so needs to go fast.
There are a few cutscenes throughout the game and a little bit of backstory from each of the bosses we'll face, but the game's focus is always on the gameplay itself. That gameplay delivered level by level, giving us 11 different worlds, each of which contain a handful of levels, usually following a loose theme, colour palette, or set of unique obstacles. So, as you can tell, everything up until this point is pretty standard. Yeah, we have some striking visuals and a pretty unique, albeit insane plot, but there's nothing that really sets us apart from the pack. That is, until we first take control of Penny. We'll freely control Penny with the left stick and can use X or R1 to jump. But instead of using the right stick for any sort of camera control, it's instead used to throw our yo-yo out in whatever direction we move the stick, allowing Penny to bonk enemies, smash crates, or even just hit different levers. Spinning the stick around in a circle will do the same thing with the yo-yo, and this comes in really handy for fighting off large groups of enemies or just for picking up groups of coins. Flicking the right stick twice will give us this dash move, shooting the yo-yo out before pulling Penny back towards it and propelling herself in that direction. You can use this to avoid enemies or even gain a little speed whilst on the ground, but performing this move in the air is where you're going to see the biggest benefit from it. It allows us to cover a pretty good distance with enough speed, acting as a base to chain together a few of Penny's other moves. There's this kind of grappling hook swing move that will keep the yo-yo in a set place in the air whilst Penny swings off it, and even the ability to ride on the yo-yo, which is great for some speed on flat ground or down slopes. Well, kind of. So obviously the movement system is a lot different than you may expect when first jumping in, and I know we've seen the likes of Ape Escape use a similar dual stick control scheme, but I can't think of any platformers that have used it to this extent. Absolutely feel free to correct me in the comments though, as I would be interested to know. But outside of that, another thing that Penny does differently is how you need to use your momentum. A lot of games have a bunch of different movement options, but they will just kind of work whenever hitting the button or combination of inputs. But that really isn't the case here. In Penny's Big Breakaway, you really need to earn your speed. Simply riding down a slope won't gain you too much momentum, but dashing into a swing beforehand, then landing on the slope at a good angle is what's really going to give you that boost of speed you're looking for. It's the same thing with crossing gaps. You can't just use the swing as a get out of jail card to make up extra distance. You have to gain that speed beforehand to propel out of the swing to get that distance. Nothing is given to you here, and if you really want to maximize your moveset, you're going to have to put the time in to get good at it. And I really think this is where Penny's Big Breakaway will divide its players. For me, the first few hours felt pretty clunky because it took me a few more levels than it should have to understand the movement and momentum I would need to do what I was trying to do. But even after I understood what the game was doing and what I needed to do to take advantage of it, that clunkiness just never really left. Now, I want to make this very clear that I am in no way saying that the game has bad movement or controls, because it doesn't. There were these moments throughout my playthrough where I would chain together my moves perfectly, unleashing a burst of speed for Penny and this rush of satisfaction for me. But I would very quickly mess up with my timing and lose both in an instant. There's a much steeper learning curve here with a much higher skill ceiling to match, and although you can just kind of brute force your way through the levels, this really isn't how they intended for you to play this one, and isn't going to go too far in creating an enjoyable experience for you. This really felt like a game of two halves for me because there's so much that I really do enjoy about it. And like I mentioned, there were these moments of me nailing that movement that felt incredible. But outside of those, it never really clicked with me in any meaningful way. But honestly, I think that's absolutely fine. In the same way as I don't think it's fair for me to say Bloodborne is bad because it's hard, or Sonic because it's too fast, or Firewatch because it has too much talking or walking or woods, I don't think it's fair for me to say Penny's Big Breakaway is bad because it has a movement system that asks more of its players than similar games. And it's okay for devs to make games that aren't for everyone. There's a core gameplay loop that they focused on, and even with the struggles I had with it personally, I still think it delivered on that for the most part. It could just be a case of me not putting enough time in to get to a point where that click finally happens, or it could be as simple as me not enjoying that style of movement, or could be the very real possibility that I'm just shit at it. But despite me not getting as much out of the game as I thought I would when first seeing it, I'm so glad that in 2024, we're still getting these blindingly bright 3D platformers that manage to innovate the genre and introduce something we've never really seen before. I fully believe that there's a lot of people that will gel with this straight away, and after a few hours, we'll be smashing the level design to bits and blasting around like absolute demons. And there's no doubt that the speedrunning communities have already formed around this one to see just how far they can push Penny's movement. I think we're so used to seeing 3D platformers that are as accessible as possible, leaning towards that comfy pick up and play style that we've been seeing for decades now. And although we've seen different movesets and gameplay mechanics in a lot of games, we don't really see them break the mold quite as much as what Penny's Big Breakaway has. So my only recommendation for this one is to try out the free demo on Steam or trial on PlayStation so that you can get a sense of how much you're going to enjoy that movement. It's going to be completely subjective, and I really don't think it will matter how many reviews you watch or how much gameplay footage you see, because if you don't enjoy the controls, there's really nothing else to sell you on it. The plot, as we said, is wacky and fun, but doesn't hold any real weight. The visuals are incredibly striking and I really did enjoy them, but after the first few worlds it becomes a little difficult to differentiate between anyway, and I was never really interested to find out what the next world would look like. The bosses do a good enough job at changing the formula up just enough, but they were the weakest aspect of the game. Either being too boring to add all that much to the experience, or too frustrating to grant a feeling of accomplishment when finally beating them. So unless you enjoy that level-to-level gameplay, there's not all that much else to invest your time into.
As I said, I just never really seemed to find my groove with it, which although is a little disappointing considering I would have loved to have said that I really enjoyed my time with it.
I'm really not going to hold it against the game because it all comes down to personal preference. But one thing I do need to mention that isn't subjective is the glitches. For a game that has such an established team behind it, with a way bigger budget than any of the games that we're going to play today, I've got to admit that I'm a little bit disappointed by the amount of glitches that I run into throughout my playthrough. And these weren't just little visual issues or sound problems, but actual glitches that would either cause a death or need me to manually restart from a checkpoint. Penny moving but the camera staying put, getting stuck in floors, the first boss that would hit me but then reset me at the wrong checkpoint and somehow do more damage, or the final boss that really did cause my frustration to boil over at one point.
I'm not going to go in depth on the fight itself, but there will be some sections of gameplay shown from it. So if you don't want to see anything from it, just skip to the timestamp on screen.
Okay, so after getting through the first stage of the fight, you're going to ride the yo-yo to reach another point of the level whilst avoiding obstacles coming towards you. But the amount of times the game would just push me off the side causing a death is ridiculous. Even whilst holding left on the stick, I could feel Penny being pushed to the right and eventually off of the edge, with absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. Then, when I eventually would get through this section, the game just shot me through the floor on multiple occasions, sending me right back. And I don't mean back to the start of this section, oh no, it would send me back to the start of the boss fight, which honestly is just kind of boring as it is. But when you're being forced to replay it over and over again through what I really don't think was any fault of my own, that meant that Penny's Big Breakaway ended with a much more sour note than I would have liked. It's such a shame because I never really felt that stable with my movement anyway, which again I completely believe is a skill issue on my part. But when you're forced to pair that with glitches and issues that you can't do anything about, I often felt more focused on just getting through the game as quickly as possible, instead of wanting to get through each stage as quickly as possible.
So in part 1, I said something to the effect of there's a certain magic in the diversity of how people enjoy things, and that's no more apparent than with Penny's Big Breakaway.
It's a game that just really isn't for me. But then a quick look on YouTube will reveal people calling this the greatest 3D platformer ever made. And that's why I'm so incredibly happy that developers are still pushing boundaries and providing people with unique games to enjoy, regardless of how much of that enjoyment I can share in personally.
If you're not completely sold on it either, you may as well just check out the demo and see if you're up for the task of taking on Penny's Big Breakaway. I was doom scrolling through YouTube shorts a few weeks ago, and when looking through the comments on a video about some old game I can't quite remember now,
I seen a comment mentioning how much they hate nostalgia, how they hate having to remember how good things were when they were younger, with no way to go back to what I assume are more favourable and less stressful times for a lot of us. But for me, I'm just happy to have the opportunity to think back on those times and remember moments that will last my lifetime.
If those moments didn't exist, then nostalgia wouldn't really mean anything.
And as someone who's filled a room of his house with a lot of his favourite things from childhood, that would really suck. As the saying goes, don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened.
Yeah, fully aware I'm running the risk of getting a little too dramatic for a video containing a game where we play as a pigeon, but I think the point I'm trying to make is, I'm just really glad that there's not only other people out there that look back fondly on games from their childhoods,
but now can recreate the familiar feeling I had when first sitting down with my N64, getting lost in the many different worlds that little plastic shell contained. I'm always excited to see what's next for gaming and seeing how far we can push past yesterday's boundary. But seeing a new wave of devs producing 3D platformers that feel right at home next to those from my childhood, it's incredibly comforting. And the best part is, there's more games coming out all of the time to get excited about. And while 3D platformers haven't always been a genre that I've stuck with, it's certainly a genre that's always stuck with me. And I truly believe it's in safe hands. I can't wait to see what else comes out this year and beyond, and with games like The Big Catch, Ruffy in the Riverside, and Crescent Overload on the horizon, it's a pretty good time to be excited about 3D platformers. We could even take a look at a few more of them in a future revival video at some point.
But for now, I've already taken enough of your time, so if you have got to this point in the video, I just want to say thank you for spending a little bit of your day exploring these games with me, and I really hope you've enjoyed seeing them as much as I've enjoyed playing them. If you did, don't forget to subscribe just to stay up to date with content from me in the future, and as always, I really hope to see each and every one of you in the next video.